Yeah. So Christopher, there is actually, okay, so this would be something that I would typically not cover because it doesn't pertain to this development workshop per se, but I would reference our YouTube channel that I linked earlier, and I'm just going to link it again. And the reason why is because my coworker, Andrea, who is also a marketer and a graphic designer for this company, just did a huge series on basically restoring black and white images, specifically in reference to what you mentioned about negatives. So that whole series is public and it's available on our YouTube channel. So I would direct you to that, and your answers will be covered there. Inverting a raw image is you can't really make any structured changes to a raw file per se, but what you can do is in ACDSee, and this is the case for all digital editors, you can't alter a raw file, but what you can do is you can create a sidecar file that the program, like in this case ACDSee, will reference to say like, hey, I would like to make a negative with this image. So I would check that out. It's going to answer a bunch of your questions. Okay, let's get started today, and I'm going to cover as much as I can, and we'll answer broader questions that maybe I'll have to skip over. I'll answer as many of those as I can at the end of the workshop, but I'll try to just answer the questions that pertain to what we're talking about today. And people are just going to keep filtering in. I think we're almost close to 200 people in here, which is awesome. Cool. Okay. So today I'm going to be using ACDSee Photo Studio Ultimate, and this, like I said, this is sort of the second episode of a two-part series I've started on develop mode. For those of you that may be coming in and didn't hear me talk about this earlier, that first episode is on our YouTube channel. It's a workshop. It's labeled under the workshop playlist. It'll be the most recent. So if you haven't seen that, I would direct you to that. And also, because workshops have a tendency to go for about an hour or so, I will also be uploading this workshop to our YouTube channel within the next couple days, so that you can reference it as well, just because there's lots of people that are internationally watching this and might have to duck out halfway through. So that is the case, and you can reference this at a later date. So today I'm going to be talking about doing a variety of changes predominantly with the brushes. So I'm actually just going to pop open this image because this is actually what we're going to be recreating today. We're going to be making a variety of different, very specific brush changes to an image. I'm going to open up the actual starting image that we have, and we can talk about it. So that's what we're going to sort of be creating, which is to recolor this car here, and also work with some sharpening adjustments and things like that. Specific brush changes to an image. Hi, Dan from Romania. I really wanted to visit Romania in May, but unfortunately, due to the whole thing, I wasn't able to, which is too bad. But next year, perhaps. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is let's talk about what we covered basically in the first workshop, so you can reference that, and then let's begin the actual workshop. So in the first workshop, I basically broke down the Tune tab. That was sort of the largely what I covered in terms of these functions. But importantly, what we also covered was snapshots and making presets. Presets are something that you can apply to multiple images and essentially run a series of changes that you make in develop mode on a whole catalog of images. And snapshots function as like temporary save points where you can save like a series of changes that you've made to an image and go, okay, well, I want to make some more changes, maybe reference those in a moment. So you can go through and you can save those changes. In addition, we talked about the Tune panel. We didn't really talk about detail, geometry, and repair. And importantly, what we're going to be talking about today are these functions that exist underneath of those main tab bars right here, which is the develop brush, linear gradient, and the radial gradient. So when you're in develop mode, a bunch of the things that we covered in the earlier episode is, for example, the tune panel. Okay, so when you change these values in the tune panel, like you change like white balance, for example, or light EQ, or tone curves, and all of these sort of things, they're universal applications on an image, meaning that they are applied to the whole image non-discriminatorily. What we would like to do occasionally in develop mode is actually adjust specific elements of our image. And that's where the secondary functions, these brush, gradient, and radial tools become really useful. They enable us to be specific about which parts of the image we're actually targeting versus doing a universal change to an image. Those of you familiar with edit mode might already be very familiar with the brush tools because it's a huge part of edit mode as well. We're going to talk about it in develop mode. Now, one thing that's important to notice and just relevant in regards to the UI, the brush gradient and also radial gradient tools themselves have a series of adjustments that they can make. So when you click on brush, for example, and you also have something like in tune open, like white balance, for example, we're not adjusting the white balance. This was already a universal application that was to our image. What we are adjusting in this case is any of these highlighted in this light gray section here, these functions, which are pretty vast. So we'll have more to talk about in terms of that. But this is what we're actually adjusting, this box here, not these subsequent boxes. And I guess where this is relevant to note is specifically in the tune panel, because there's the most sub boxes where you can make universal applications. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to recolor this car. We're going to recolor it to a green color using a series of brushes. And then we're going to make some radial gradient adjustments so that we can blur the background, but not the subject, which is in this case, this car right here. So let's start that process. So let's talk about first brushes, tolerance, and smart brushing. Okay, so you're saying like, Adam, I see you have this blue car here. How would I go about starting that selection? How do I make this car a different color? And again, when you're making selections, it doesn't necessarily have to be about color. It can be about a variety of things, but this is what we're going to be talking about today. Light EQ, I do not know the answer to that, Trevor. What Trevor asked was, will the light EQ tool be added to the brushes in Ultimate 21? That's a great question. And I would maybe send me an email and I'll ask the developers whether or not that is a consideration. I know that the develop mode always sees yeah, exactly. So they slowly sort of move and add those tools to the develop mode. So that's very well something that could occur. But I don't know. So you have to get back to me. So when I click the brush section here, the obvious tools is that I have access to the nib width. So if I have no selection mode currently, I can adjust this nib width by rolling my scroll bar on my mouse, or by adjusting the actual slider that is right here. Feathering applies a sort of in this case, a softness to the edge of our brush. A feathering to me is the way that I describe it is it's a very gradual decrease of the effect from the edge of the brush. Versus our other brush here, which have very hard designated stops, feathering in this case is a much softer area of selection. You'll notice that as I'm brushing, there's this like red indicator that pops up. All this is it's just showing where our brush strokes exist. We can change this color using this little panel right here. So if we wanted to change it to like a different color, like green, for example, we could display it. And this might be useful in this case because you might be working with an image that has a lot of reds in it. So we can just adjust that at any point. I can also turn it off. Now, again, that makes our changes quite invisible in this case. We would have to actually make an application. In this case, I've dramatically increased the exposure to then see with brush strokes turned off. But that's hideous, so we're gonna keep with the brush stroke indicator for now. And then pressure and tolerance. Let's talk about that. Pressure in this case is the severity of each individual click. So if I click once, it's a very soft selection, and if I click twice, it's a bit of a harder selection, etc. If pressure is just always set to maximum, then it's always the maximum amount of pressure that can be applied. So there's no softness in it, it's just a hard application in this case. And then there is smart brushing. And smart brushing is the tool that we're going to be using today to make an accurate selection. Smart brushing was added a couple issues ago, and it's so useful. It's such an awesome tool. So by default, smart brushing is turned off, which means that there's no sort of variation in regards to the selection process. It's not keeping in mind anything that's in the background. It's not being mindful of the contents. It's truly just giving you, in this case, a selection based upon exactly where your cursor is. You may notice that I'm sort of erasing these, and you can erase a selection in this case by right-clicking. With smart brushing turned on, it will be mindful of what exists in the background, and as you can see, it'll start to change and adjust based on what the content is. So if I have my cursor, in this case, over top of a blue image, you can see that it's being mindful of that color while I'm making that selection. So it's making sure not to basically select anything that wouldn't be within that color. Magic, in this case, the smart brushing mode of Magic, is a combination of both color and brightness. So if I just set this to color, it would just care that an image is, in this case, is blue, or this parts of the image is blue. But you might not be selecting a image based on color as a quality. You might be setting it on brightness or a tone in this case, right? So you can adjust it based on that as well. I find that when I'm making most of my selections, keeping both of those qualities together actually produces the best result, especially in this case where if we're looking at our image, I'm just going to unselect our car here for a second. Let's just reset these qualities. There is some variation in light right here. So we want to be mindful of both the color that's occurring in those cases, but also the brightness of the car in itself. So keeping it at a magic setting is useful. Now, let's talk about tolerance. Eventually, we're going to make a selection of this car. That's the game plan. Tolerance is really useful for being extremely specific. Let's set this to very low. I'm going to set this like to a 10 tolerance. You'll notice as I brush over that portion of the image, it's being a little bit more opinionated in regards to those qualities that we had earlier, the magic, in this case, the color and brightness. So there's entire sections of it where you notice this speckling occur, right? And this, again, this is because it's being a bit more opinionated, a bit more discriminatory about which colors it's selecting. If I move this tolerance bar in the exact opposite direction, what you'll notice is that it's far less discriminatory about which colors it selects. And what you'll see is those individual dots where there might be differences in color will start to disappear. In this specific instance, we have a car that's like relatively blue, and it's somewhat unanimous in terms of the color. So it actually makes more sense to have the tolerance set to a higher number than if we have something that we want to select where there's much more variations in color and we want to be very specific. Maybe an example of that would be like literal hairs on a person's head, or things like leaves on a tree where we want to be very specific about which color leaves or something like that we're affecting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around and select our car. And you may notice that there's certain elements that I'm selecting as we go through. Maybe that we didn't intend to, but for the most part, it's actually doing a really good job. I'm just going to unselect this little light that exists right here. And I'm just going to keep going on. And again, I have my tolerance set quite high. I'm actually going to zoom in now because I want to be a bit more particular about it. But this is, again, a development change where we're suggesting which parts of our image that we want to change. And you're probably thinking, hey, Adam, that's great, but why do you have, like, what about this red image that is useful? Well, when we're actually done our selection process, we can hide this red area that I'm showing you right now, and we can go about adjusting that. So we can go about tweaking these values that exist on the left-hand side here, like temperature or fill light or clarity or hue and that sort of thing, and work with that. So I'm just going to go through and I'm just going to make sure that this selection is complete. I'll have a quick look at some of the questions that are coming in. Tolerance does not affect erasing, but in this mode, when you go to, I guess, undo an action, if your tolerance is set really low, you'll notice that it does affect that instance of, I don't want to call this erasing because erasing is sort of a different tool in ACDSee, but it does affect the undo process of a selection. Hopefully that answers your question. So yeah, it can be more selective either way in this case, with the application of the selection or the undo of it. Yeah, I think I will explain the pressure again, but a pressure means when you hold down your mouse, for example, on an area, right? With pressure set really low, you'll notice that you actually have to run past a couple times, meaning that okay, say I want to be very selective about this section right here. Let's crank down our pressure all the way to 5, say. You'll notice that as I brush on, this red, right, that selection process is really, 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 really soft. It's super, super soft. And this is because we've set the brush pressure really, 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 really low. Think of it as you literally taking a paintbrush to an image, and instead of like pressing down on the paper or your canvas, you're gently placing it over top of it. You're making really light adjustments. We're sort of doing the same thing in this process. The difference is because I know where I want to apply this selection. I'd rather apply it with firmer pressure than with softer pressure. So that's sort of the difference there. I rarely use a soft pressure. Again, when I want to use a soft pressure, it's really when I'm very, very subtly tweaking colors and things like that on images. This change is going to be very dramatic. So we won't need that. We're going to want a firmer pressure applied here. Let's see here. How do you unselect the brushing while in the process? Unselect it. Well, as I mentioned earlier, you can right click to undo that selection. Also, what you can do is you can hit this reset all settings brushstroke right here to basically remove any brushes that you have active. We'll talk about these shortly because you'll notice that there's multiple brushes that we have there, but that may answer your question. Just about done now. I just got this to look really good, so I'm taking a bit of time with this selection. Okay. Pixel targeting is not a function that is, unfortunately, isn't in develop mode, but I want it to be in develop mode because this process would be made much quicker with something like pixel targeting available. I've actually asked for that to be added to develop mode. Another useful thing, and in regards to edit mode functionality, is the ability to target luminosity as well, which I would like to see in develop mode. I think those are two things that would be very easy to add to this mode, and I think it would really dramatically improve it. But right now, we're working by hand. That answers your question. I'm not using a tablet, although you can. I believe in develop mode, it supports that. I'm just using a mouse. It's so funny. I'm a graphic designer. I've done it for 10 years, and and everybody in my industry uses Wacom tablets, which is essentially a tablet with a pen application, right? And and I've never used them. I've always used a mouse, and I'm actually kind of not bad with it. But it definitely makes more sense for people that are hard illustrators than someone like me who's more of a digital editor. That is where you're going to find that usage. Really, having the pen application is really useful. Okay, so that's pretty good. Let's zoom out a little bit and have a look. I'd like to update that a little bit, but looks pretty good. That's our selection. So the brush selection is the first one on our panel here. You'll notice that if I unhide it, right, I can unhide it by clicking the little box that exists over top of it. The brush itself is sort of indicated that it's been turned on in this case by that little brush icon that is now blue at the base here. And that icon that exists above it indicates that you can either hide it from view or unhide it from view. This is going to make more sense when we actually make some temperature and tint and hue changes to this image. So let's do that. Just take a second here. In this case, we will be able to say if we've made what Claude asked is, will you be able to tell if you missed a small area before proceeding further? Because develop mode is it's a parametric non-destructive editor. It actually doesn't matter where we've made the issue. When we go to change the color, we can adjust this further at any point. It's totally non-destructive. So let's illustrate that. Let's start the process of changing this car's color so that we can illustrate to Claude how we can further adjust it if need be. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off show brush strokes. So I'm going to click this little button right here. And let's start to tweak the actual temperature, color, and hue of this car. So let's go color strength, okay? And let's utilize this, and I'm gonna just maximize this tab right here, because what I wanna do is I want to adjust the overall hue to a green color from that of a blue color. And to illustrate Claude's point, I think we can see right off the bat that this section right on the roof here is a bit bluer than what I'd like. So during this process of adjusting the color of the car, let's actually correct this right now. So I'm still in this brush application. You can see that by the brush stroke being applied. In this case, I'm actually going to keep the show brush strokes turned off, okay? What I'm also going to do is I'm going to turn off smart brushing, because it was clear that smart brushing wasn't sure what to do with this rust area at the very top. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it off, and I'm just going to run my mouse along that area to correct this color. And as you can see, as I run my mouse along it, it parametrically changes the color as we're going by. I'm just going to fix that top section. And so what we'll do is I can show you the brushstroke again, and it'll see very clearly, okay, that section up top there has now been added to the selection. Let's actually just get rid of that guy right there. Okay, so we can add or remove during this process. Let's again unclick show brushstrokes, and we'll zoom out again. And let's add some more adjustments to this, because I want to tone the temperature up. I want this to look really lime green, and I don't think we're quite there yet. It's kind of still a sage-like green. Let's pop over to color EQ, okay? And in this panel, in the tune panel with the brush, we have a general panel which has exposure, saturation, vibrance, temperature, tint, fill light, contrast, clarity, color strength, and hue. Under the color EQ panel, we have further adjustments that we can make to these very specific color frames within our image. So as you can see, we have red, orange, yellow, green, cyan, blue, purple, and magenta. And I think what I want to do is adjust probably the saturation and the hue slightly more. So let's drop some values. What ideally I don't want to see is blues in our selection, purples in our selection, magentas in our selection. What I want to see is probably a bit more greens in that cyan. I want to maybe increase the yellows a little bit more to green. So we're starting to see a really dramatic change of a lime green in this area. I'm also seeing a little bit of abrasion down here, so I'm going to reduce that slightly. So that sort of goes away. Just going to tweak these values. But in essence, what I'm doing is I'm going into the hue panel and I'm reducing values. I'm getting rid of whole colors that exist within our selection. So for example, I'm removing our blue, purple, and magenta because I really want to increase the lightness of the green sections of our image. So I'm bringing in more yellows. I'm moving our cyans closer to green, and I'm starting to get those changes in our image here, which is being actually well represented here. Maybe we even slightly reduce those reds and oranges. And I'm going to actually adjust as well, probably the top of the car here, where again, you see some sort of rust. I want that to come through similar to the way that we did the top here. So that's what I'm quite happy with that in the color EQ. It's very bright. Let's zoom in and fix that one section here. And again, I'm going to keep smart brushing turned off during this process. We don't need to be that discriminatory in these areas. We can actually just brush it on. Let's add that area here. Okay. Let's have a look through here. Yeah, so Ted asked if you want to use a color already exists. Wait, is there a dropper to select? Oh, I see. Like as if you want to select. Let me see. Ted, maybe reframe that question. I'm not sure I fully understand. Oh, sure. Color contrast is something that we can talk about as well. So we've sort of made, let's make some contrast changes because in this panel right here, we do have a contrast section. Again, all of these changes are in essence where our brush exists. So this brush we have here. Maybe let's make a new brush and we can add some contrast. Let's play around with some of these fields right here. So let's have a look again to see what our changes are. So we have on this selection, we have a temperature change, we have a hue adjustment, and then we've gone in and we've tweaked the values further in the hue column here. I just want to play around. If we were to add more contrast to that of the green, so the areas of the image that are the most green, like this area here, we're pulling more white into that section. If we reduce that back to a 0, and then we can add more darker contrast to section. This kind of interrupts a bit of the image right here. Let's play around with some of these other sliders. Oh yeah, okay, so it's referencing off of the base image here. So the car itself was cyan to begin with. So if we really crank that cyan contrast further, we can add a lot more blacks, darker colors in this section. And I bet if we use the reverse on this case, we can dramatically increase. So add a lot of brightness in that area, or I guess in this case, pull the contrast up higher. Let's change the blue, just out of curiosity. So what this is referencing is our selection is applied to this area, but it's referencing, in this case, the original image. So when we went and changed like cyan, for example, it's referencing the color that's already pre-existing in the original. So as we go and pull those values, like when we pulled the green further, we didn't notice much change. It was just in the areas that had some inherent green already in the image. So anyway, so we've gone ahead and we've basically changed. That's perfect. Actually, I'm going to reduce the contrast because that looks awesome. It's very bright. It looks like a sports car. Okay. Okay, so Peter asked, what factors do you take into account when you choose to use saturation, brightness, hue, and contrast in color EQ? I would say that it depends on the image, but let's use this as an example. My goal here was to change this image to this blue car, the one that we started with here, to that of like a bright green car. And my factors that I considered in this case, well, obviously we don't want to impact anything that's around this image. Because this image has, the car is primarily blue, but there's other aspects of this image that might have blue in their spectrum. And obviously things like this parking sign where it's a P, right, are very clearly blue. So the first consideration is like, what parts of the image do I want to affect? I want to affect the car primarily, so let's work with a brush selection to get that really, really applied well. And then let's work within the general panel and the color EQ panel to sort of tweak certain values. So again, when we're looking at this base image, this blue car, right? There's certain things we want to turn down, values that we want to remove depending on what hue we want this car to appear as. If I'm trying to get blue out of an image, especially if I'm trying to get a limer color, like something that has a bit more heat to it in it, what we want to do is we want to drop the cooler sliders. So blue, purple, and magenta are sliders that we want to basically minimize. We want less of that color, less of that hue appearing within our image. What we want in this case is the hue to be turned on the hotter side with emphasis on the fact that our image is primarily green. We want to maintain that as sort of a color. So I guess what I'm doing is I'm just playing around with these hue values until I find the medium that I find to be useful. I'm not sure if that totally answers your question, but in terms of changing the hue of a car, obviously the slider we're going to use the most is hue, and depending on whether or not we want more brightness in those colors or want more saturation or less saturation in those colors, we'll adjust those sliders, which exist brightness right here and saturation right here. I'm fine with how popping this car. It's very popping in terms of the image, so I don't really need to adjust saturation or brightness in this case. How is this selection different from the Magic Wand? It's different in that it's done in develop mode. And it's different because it is, Magic Wand doesn't exist in develop mode. Magic Wand is an edit mode tool. But Magic Wand also is not something you can control, in the essence that it's going to use its best guess based upon pixels that occur within an image. So when you select a specific part of your image, it's going to go like, okay, well, what areas around that in this image share those pixel qualities, and then select them based on tolerance. Develop mode is not like edit mode in the sense that edit mode has lots of destructive qualities that can be made non-destructive. Everything you do in develop mode is a parametric non-destructive edit, meaning it can be I can return this image to its original values. I can change individual fields, like individual sections, where to impact just individual color choices. Like that's that parametric non-destructive section. So I would say that these tools are very different. I mean, I could be working on a raw image right now. I can't, and I can be saving an XMP profile like we discussed in the previous workshop to this raw file that you simply can't do to an image in edit mode. So they're totally different. Okay. The next thing we're going to do is, there's a couple things we're going to do, but we have an inherent selection right here. Okay, so what I would like to do is move now from this and start talking about maybe adjusting. Let's sort of get some deeper greens of this, and maybe choose more specific areas where they come into effect. And then the other thing I think what I'd like to maybe do next is also make some. I want to increase the noise, or in this case, the sharpness in this area. So we've illustrated the develop brush. Let's talk about the linear gradient and the radial gradient tool. I'm going to do that in the detail panel. So at the very top here, next to Toot, I'm going to click detail. Okay. And the thing I want to do is increase the sharpness of this image right where our subject is here, in this case, the car. If I want to do that, I would select this radial gradient, and I would move it until it encompasses my car here. So let's find a home for this. I'm just going to tweak these values. So I can sort of cover the majority of our subject. There we go. So what I did here is I clicked on the radial gradient, and then it'll pop up with this this gradient function. And I could just pull these values until I can see that my subject is covered. What you also might notice is the same way that our brush tool has its own brush settings, we have the same for our gradient function. If we hover over our gradient, you'll see that our background is what currently is selected. The selected component being, of course, the red in this case. What we want to do is we want to invert that because we only want to affect the car, and it currently is, so that the car is the only thing that actually is being unaffected. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click the invert gradient function and then again hover over to indicate that my car is what is selected here. And you'll notice that it turns red, which indicates to me that I'm going to be sharpening that area. So let's increase the sharpening on our image here. Let's have a little look at the preview. And I might tweak threshold and radius slightly. I think it's right there is what we want. That's probably hard to see, so let's deactivate that and activate again. You can see it through the thumbnail here. Oops, didn't mean to do that. To undo. Undo. Oops. Just gonna reapply that. Oh, and then increase the sharpness here. As we increase the sharpness on our image, we'll start to see this preview change. So if I just dramatically reduce this, it'll blur the car. And then if I increase it, you'll start to see it become a pop, especially on firm lines, like in and around the windows or where you can really see this the most. Let's move around with our thumbnail and see if we can illustrate that better. As I increase this, it's probably really subtle and maybe not visible over zoom, but I'm really starting to see silvers and things like that pop in that area. It's actually far too aggressive, so I want to reduce it slightly, but it's still the effect that we're going for. The other thing I would like to maybe do as well is increase the feathering. So again, the feathering going around the outside of this ellipse that we've added here. We want that to be gradual. We don't want it to be like a hard change. The worry in this case is that parts of this image where there's like the Christmas lights around the corner here, these would be like far too aggressive, and then there would be too little feathering that would occur between that and the outside. So I'm going to increase that slightly. And then when we're happy with that, we're probably going to make another radial gradient, but it's going to be with the opposite structure because we want to blur out the background slightly. So let's add a second gradient. So I have a radial gradient selected here. I'm going to click on the second on the panel here, right here. Click on it. And that basically opens up a brand new radial gradient for us to play with. And this one is going to be independent of the other ones. So when I move away from this, I'm not removing either of these gradients. I'm working with two different gradients in this case. I'm just going to apply this, and then I'll have a look at some of the questions here. I'm just going to go through, and what I actually want to do is have this application affect the background. I want to slightly blur out the background. Let's have a look. Oops, there we go. Yeah, so we're working with that. Perfect. I'm going to pull the sharpness down until we can start to see our image blur out the background slightly. Right there. And let's increase the feathering so it doesn't look so dramatic. I think we're good. So where this is really coming into effect is obviously on the sign. Let's have a look at the original again. So the clarity is, so we're pulling our eye away from the background into the foreground with our center being this car here. Let's go back to our develop brush and I'll have a look at some of these questions. Okay. So Trevor asked, what does the threshold slider do exactly? Okay, so threshold in the brush tool, and it goes the same for the gradients as well. Threshold, that's actually within a sharpening function overall. So this functionality is independent of the radial gradient. I realized I had this open in the previous one, and actually the settings that I want are just right here. They're not at this base point. But if I was sharpening this whole image, for example, the threshold can change the area. All of these fields themselves, like the radius, and the like, if I increase the overall amount of sharpening on this image, the whole image will start to see more granular. Okay. If I increase the radius, it's going to change the shape of how that granular detail is added. And then the threshold in this case does very similar to the way that the tolerance affects brushes. And the threshold is going to be more particular with the areas that it's affected with that overall sharpening increase. It's hard to explain. It's probably something that I would definitely play around with these functions. But what I would like to instill is, because this is a overall function of this whole image, what we're actually working with are these secondary, or these the radial gradient functions that exist right in this primary box right here. I'm actually going to undo that section. Oops. And that appears very unusual. Why does it do that? Oh, this is probably, yeah, okay. It needs to be like 50. Oh, okay. I need to fix this. What did I do? I feel like I've applied a sharpening adjustment on top of the already. This one, low sharpness. This one. There we go. Okay. I was just looking at too many fields there. Okay. Let's see here. What other questions we got? Difference between the first sharpness slider and the sharpening tab. That was covered. Do new ultimate develop tools work in color card? David, your question in regards to color card calibration, I would send that to me in an email. And the reason why is because that would be something that the developers would know. I do not know. Okay. So Peter, actually, right, that was the question that, Peter, you asked me this in an email. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to save the area that you've carefully brushed in tuning and apply it to the detail brush? So I looked into this. And as you've implied, it's not possible to take this brush. So the brush we've created right here, for example, you'll see it outlined in orange of our subject, the car. We're able to save this as a preset. And this exact brush, so if we go up to this section right here, where we talked about presets in the previous video, and we go, I'm going to save this preset, and I'm going to save it as, let's call brush car, and I'm going to name it as brush car 2, and I'll hit OK. It'll save that preset. I can use this preset on other images. Perhaps I might have taken more images of this car, for example. Let's give an example of this. But in essence, what you want to do, that function of being able to take that and move it into the details panel, is not something that we're able to do yet. But it is something that I've talked to the developers literally today prior to this workshop, and they're all like, yep, that seems super reasonable. We can add that to the next or list of changes that we want to do. This would be a bad example because obviously I don't have the same car in this instance, but what I could do is then load that via our preset panel. And as you can see here, those values, the greens, the cyans, and things like that, in the brush section have been adjusted to match the presets of our previous image. Again, bad example in the sense that we don't want to replicate that over this image, but you can save those presets. What Peter is mentioning, though, is, hey, I'd really like to take those functions and then move them over to something like detail. to take that and we go, okay, well, I have this brush selection. I would like to then paste it, but unfortunately, that's not something we can do at this time. But it's something that the developers were, as of today, we're like, yep, that's something that we can add. So hopefully that answers your question. I know that was an email that I wanted to touch base with. So, okay. Yeah. So yeah, I agree. So let's talk about that. Arthur asked, green looks somewhat splotchy in this section of the car right here. Actually, what I think it looks like is a bit more granular than I'd maybe want. So what we could do is we could add a detail brush, go in and we can maybe smooth some of that area out. Let's try it out. I'm going to use the brush here. And I'm going to probably have a high feathering set in that area. And let's just see what happens when we go through and just lower the sharpness in that area. Let's see if we can sort of address some of that concern of it looking a little bit more granular than we wanted. So if we lower the sharpness and right about there, I would say, and we can go through and sort of apply that a bit further. And we can fix this in color too. There's a lot of methods. I think that what this came through is actually in the contrast changes we made, but hey, there's lots of ways to fix something and that might be one way to look at it. Deactivate, activate. You can start to see some of those areas that harshness come out a little bit. So doing this for a customer, I noticed that the B pillar, I'm assuming what he means right here, behind the steering wheel inside the car is still blue. Can I change this to green without undoing any of my previous actions? Yeah, you absolutely can. So again, just because this is a parametric edit, so what we want to do is we want to be in the tune panel where we made all this color changes, right? And I have clicked this develop brush to make sure that we're still interacting with that develop brush. And you'll notice that panel right here, which I believe the attendee is mentioning, is this is still comes through very blue. So what we can do is we can then just add to this brush selection. So I'll just go up over in the corner here to show brush strokes. We'll turn it back on and let's just reselect this section. I'm just going to crank down the nib width and increase the feathering. There we go. And turn on a magic again. And let's just add this area to our selection. And let's see how this affects. I think I would even add a bit more feathering. Yeah. This overall image. So then again, we're adding to this general tab. And then all of these changes that apply, the general and color EQ changes, will then be applied as well to that area. And we can go in and we can be a little bit more selective. There we go. And fix it. So I'm assuming that's what what you mean is that section back there, which definitely appeared quite blue, can be fixed in addition to that. So Peggy asked, can you use the brush to darken the light in the doorway? Yeah, let's add that actually. How are we going to do that? Let's add another develop brush. Okay. So I'll add this, enable this brush right here. And so this is a whole new brush. It's totally independent from our first one, this one right here. This is a brand new one. So let's go in and let's select our doorway here. I'm just trying to think if this would be the best tool for this, or whether or not it might be better to use a radial linear gradient tool. No, because then it would affect the rest of it. Yeah. Okay, so let's do this. I'm actually just going to turn smart brushing off because I think it would be easier to go through and then just make a selection in that area. Oops, it's looking a bit artifacty. I'm going to zoom out. There we go. I'm just going to go through and really roughly, I can use the smart brushing tool. I can in this area if I wanted to, but I'm just going to quickly go through and make that selection. And then what I can do is under the tune panel, still within the brush sections here, let's say that for now. Okay, in this section, what we can do is let's go to tone curves and just crank that down a little bit. Let's see how this affects our image. So original, let's see here. Original, we'll unhide it. lots of light in that section. And then if we turn it on, starting to see that our area darken. I can even pull it further down. I can pull it further up to add light to that section. Further down to darken that section. So it gives you an idea of being able to take something like curves, for example, and to just adjust the light in one area specifically. I would go through and I would maybe tweak that. But again, what we're doing is we're also seeing based on an existing blur that's happening in the background too. But yeah, that's how I would go about maybe darkening the doorway. I would definitely be a bit more particular with our selection, but I think that that's super possible with tone curves. And again, just adding a secondary brush, which is independent of our first brush, if that makes sense. Okay. Another thing I'd like to do, maybe before I start looking at some more particular questions, one of the last things I want to do before I finalize an image, I would definitely want to go in and affect the geometry. So geometry enables you to essentially crop this image. It enables you to rotate and straighten this image. And what you'll notice at the top here is there's a whole lens correction profile, which you can also apply. So in raw mode, depending on which model of camera you have, there is a little list here that allows you to pick a make and model and a specific lens type of a camera. So in this case, I could go through and pick Canon or Kodiak or Pentax or whatever, and the specific model that's supported, in which case I'll go to Canon, and you'll notice that all these different camera models are supported based on Canon as a maker, and it'll adjust the field of view based on the way that that lens looks. So this is a very specific make correction based on whatever camera you're using to take. Obviously, these corrections can also be applied manually, and you can save presets based on this one field. So if I wanted to say like make a manual correction for one of my my cameras, so I have a Canon camera, and I don't like the lens correction that this functionality lists, or maybe it's a camera that has yet to be adopted for a lens correction. Well, I can simply make a manual correction and then save that preset so that it applies to whatever image. Also, I would note too that if you are applying a lens correction, these things, as soon as you turn on enable lens profile, it'll search for your camera based on your photos metadata. So if your photo has metadata of taken with a Canon, EOS 100D, it'll search for that, find it, and apply it. Anyway, but I don't actually need a lens correction because I don't know what lens was used to take this. So I'm just going to undo that. What I am going to do is straighten this image because it's heinous how off straight it is. What I would like to do is straighten this image actually based on the building itself, not on the ground. So I'm going to straighten it using the rotate and straighten function. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set it up so that these lines match the column that exists right here. Actually, it matches pretty well here. I believe this street is actually somewhat crooked, but the actual building itself is built straight. So we'll do that, and then we'll move back to the tune panel, and it'll apply those changes to our image. What Mike said, saving the mask to use over again? So again, it's not really a mask, but it's a brush selection. But in regards to what Peter asked earlier, is what isn't possible yet is to save a preset of a brush and then use it within a different field, like detail, for example. But you absolutely can save a preset of the brush that you made in Tune Panel and apply to another image using those settings. So that is possible. But there isn't necessarily per se a mask. Masking is more of an edit mode functionality than it is a development functionality. Can you use clone in this mode? Yeah, there's the last function. So currently we've made some tune adjustments to the color of this image. And actually, it's kind of bugging me. I'm going to go and fix this one. So I'm going to go back into, let's crank that. There we go. Oh, so much better. Okay, I just wanted to reduce the contrast there. The question is there a clone functionality? Yes. So there's Tune, which we covered in relation to changing the color of this image. There's the detail function, which we used to reduce the sharpness of the background and increase the sharpness of our bug here. And there's the geometry panel, which enabled us to straighten this image. And then finally, there's the repair tool, which enables you to repair parts of your image. So if I wanted to, for example, let's say remove these dots from these bolts from the wheel, for example, or remove this red section right here, I can do so. Let's try this out. Let's actually do a blended clone. So what a blended clone is it's a clone change to the image that also does its best to use the surrounding area to smartly fill that area instead of just being a hard clone. So just think of it as a mixture of heal and clone. I'm going to copy that right here and apply that. And I need to change, as you notice, that I filled that area in with blue, in essence, based on our original image here. What I would then need to do is go into the tune function, and I would just need to add that section to this first brush here, if that makes sense, because as you can see, it was omitted in the original selection. So I would just go in and I would paint that green, and there we go. We have cloned out a section of our image there. Is it possible to recolor a black object? If the object has no light, no. But if the object is just like a series of really dark grays and things like that, you can play around with exposure and probably get some results for that, for sure. But like a hard black object where there exists no light, no. Ways to check that, I would go to your histogram, or rather your clipped shadows and highlights. True blacks are indicated as green in an image. So in this image, I could not get any detail out of this section of the image because, as you can see here, it's indicated as true black. So there would be no tonal detail to gain or to infer out of that area. True whites are indicated as red in using this little show clip shadows and highlights, but that gives you an idea. So the answer to that question is yes, maybe. Okay, so Robin asked, using your first brush selection, can you invert that selection, apply, move it to create a second brush selection, lighten one part and darken the remainder? Like, can I use this selection to inform another selection? I'm wondering if I can. I don't believe I can copy that brush. I think that is a current limitation of that. I would need to recreate that brush stroke. What I was saying earlier about being able to preset or save a preset of an image applies to whatever pre-existing brushes you've created. So I wouldn't be able to add new brushes based on that preset. I think, unfortunately, short answer to question, Robin, is no. I'm not able to do that without creating a new brush selection. But again, this is a challenge that I'd like to address. Charles asked, ACDSee Photo Studio Professional. Everything that we've done so far is possible in ACDSee Photo Studio Professional. Develop mode is functionally identical in Professional to that of ACDSee Ultimate. The difference between Ultimate and Professional is that Professional does not have any layered editing capabilities. ACDSee Photo Studio 2020 or Photo Studio Ultimate 2020 is the only one that has layered editing capabilities. Giuseppe asked, and the same for lens distortion, some tools is missing within Mac. So again, I'll just to reiterate, a Mac is a product, our Mac product is not, it's not in the same level as a development scale as our PC product. This is slowly changing. We have applied way more resources to that of our Mac product, but it's still in development. And what we're doing right now is we're in the process of trying to catch our Mac product up with some of the more complicated or some of the more advanced functionalities of ACDSee Photo Studio Ultimate. So short answer of that is it is normal and it will be changing. It's in the process of being updated constantly. So yes. Yeah, I mean, Bonnie, you can also clone out the light for sure. The difference between vibrance and saturation is okay. So think of like a light bulb, like in you know how when you're looking at a like a incandescent light bulb versus like a really old school I'm even forgetting the word because I it's been so long, but like you're seeing a light that has more more vibrancy, more color in that light. Saturation is the process of it has the same lighting qualities, but you're taking away color when you're reducing saturation from an image. When you remove saturation from an image, you've made it, in essence, grayscale. The same is not true for vibrance. You can still have an image that maintains those colors within it, but those colors are duller when you reduce vibrance versus much more poignant and like bright and crisp in vibrance. I would say that you know, depending on how you use those sliders, a good example is my own work. I often work with black and, or rather old photography images that were taken with in sepia, and when I want to make those images in essence grayscale or black and white, I reduce the saturation as much as possible, and that will produce basically a grayscale image. Yeah. Can we remove the rust spots that are still seen? Yeah, we can. It would take a while, but we could do so within the repair process. Absolutely. What I might also do too is I might also finalize this image, save a copy of it, and bring it into edit mode to remove some of these more complicated areas. But I would say that it would just take a moment of going through and repairing your image slowly with like something like the blended clone tool. Thomas asked, next time, can you tell us to change the sky in a landscape? Sure, I can actually show you that right now. It doesn't have to be next time. So let's go over to manage mode, and we'll choose an image, and we're going to make some like pretty different change. I'll make it very different in the sky in the landscape image. So let's just go into, let me find a nice image that I like. Let's go into, yeah, I'll just go into this landscapes folder. Let's say, yeah, this is a perfect example. I'm going to bring this image into develop mode, and let's take a linear gradient tool. Okay, so we just want to affect the sky. Now I can go through and I can use the brush tool to like select exactly the sky in our image, but it's just going to take too long. So what I'd rather do is have a nice radial gradient that allows us to adjust just the sort of portions that are in the top portion of our image here, this sky section. And then what I'll do is with tune selected and linear gradient and the gradient applied in this top portion, in essence, the part of it that's red, I can, for example, maybe based on a previous conversation, let's go in and crank the vibrance in that area. And as you can see, it gets way bluer. All of the blues are bluer. All of the dark blues are dark bluer. All of the pinks are pinker. I can even increase the temperature maybe to warm it up. So maybe adding some yellows in here to make these more green. If I go into color EQ, maybe I really want the magentas to pop. So maybe I'll just crank the magenta. Oh, you know, let's do that in hue instead of in saturation. There we go. Maybe I'll make these purples more red. But no, it actually definitely makes more sense to pull those over here. Let's do that again. Let's do it in, let's do them in brightness. There we go. It looks a little bit better. Crank that down a bit. So you can go through and you can change those individual values based on whatever you've selected. So again, the selection is a linear selection. It's the selection that exists in the top portion of our image, and then we're adjusting unique colors based on that interaction. So I'm going in and I'm making the magentas darker, and I'm going in and I've made the magentas more saturated. You know, these things can be changed in that area. Yeah. So yes, you can change the sky in landscapes. My recommendation would do, especially in this case where you have a real soft, beautiful landscape, would just be to use the linear gradient tool. Yeah. Ted asks, is there an eyedropper to select a color? There's not for this mode. There's not an eyedropper tool. Jim asked, how is clarity different from sharpness? That's actually a really good question. I'm not sure. In detail, let's see here. Oh, maybe it's in the tune panel. Where did you see that? Clarity. Let's increase the clarity. Well, my guess would be, oh, it is a very, it does have a very similar effect. Interesting. And that's still being applied to that top portion and not the base portion? Let's reduce this. Whoa, I see. Okay, so that's fully. And then let's have the same effect. Let's go back into detail. And let's do this. Let's reduce the, I'll make the same selection roughly, and let's reduce the sharpness. Okay, and increase the sharpness. Okay. And once again, does it also remove the lighthouse though? Ah, interesting. I see. Okay, the difference. We have some very structured detail in here where this lighthouse exists. When I reduce the clarity, it softens all of the clouds, but barely affects or impacts this sort of structured area, which is the lighthouse and the gate here, or rather the fence here. But when I make that same change in the detail panel in sharpness, nah, it's way less discriminatory. So my guess would be that there is a sort of like a, when the doves created clarity, they wanted to be hyper specific about which elements were made softer or were made much more granular. And my guess is it's somewhat content aware based on the interaction we had with the lighthouse there. Hopefully that answers your question, Jim. Oh yes, and Gert, I'm so sorry. Yeah, that's a really good point. Vibrance does normally target skin tones. It's fairly good at targeting like whiter or more like olive skin tones. Okay, Rick asked Adam, can you make a better photo from a RAW comparing to a good JPEG? Okay, that's a good question. I would start with, when you're editing in develop mode, I would start with a RAW file. And when you've finalized your RAW edits, what you're going to do is you're going to save that as a different file format. You're going to save it as a TIFF file or a JPEG or a PNG or whatever you utilize for your post-processing. But RAW files contain a lot of detail. They house a ton of visual information, way more than a JPEG. But in ACDSee, when you open up a RAW file, it has to go through the process of, in essence, converting that file to a JPEG for the purpose of saving those changes. I guess what I mean is you open it and it's going to reference it as a RAW file, and it's going to save those adjustments that you make to that raw file into a sidecar file, and that sidecar file is called an XMP file. And that file contains all of these adjustments like sharpness and tune or whatever we did today. All of those fields are adjusted. And then when you go to look at that raw file in the future, it is going to it's going to reference that XMP profile and preview that image with those adjustments. When is it better to use one or the other? Not really. Most people take raw and just so that they have the highest quality base image to start with, and then they edit from that. But a really good JPEG, a high quality JPEG, you may not notice those things when you go through the process of post processing, because you're already in a somewhat manner, you're going to be making adjustments and basically compressing that image. There's no way to get around image compression when it comes to photo editing in general. I'm not sure if that answers your question. It's just kind of when it comes down to it, it's more of a preference thing than anything else. Arthur asked, you're starting to get some pinks in the rocks, how to prevent? Yeah, I mean, I think that if you want to be hyper specific about the color, I would go through and I would use the developer brush instead of the linear gradient. That would be my suggestion. In this case, when we look at our gradient mask, you'll notice that a portion of the gradient mask is actually affecting the rocks on which that we see here. What we can do within the linear gradient is draw this line further up. And as you can see, what you'll notice is it will reduce the feathering, reduce the or rather increase the intensity of the change, so that it might affect less of that rock area there. But ultimately, the best selection you can make is the one that you make by hand using the brush selection tool. Okay, that's a ton of questions. We're at about an hour and 15 minutes here. What I would suggest is, what I'm going to do is I'm going to obviously post this to our YouTube channel in a couple days so you can reference the first and second part of this series. If you have any further questions, I'm going to add my email to the list here so that you guys can reference that. I would love for any questions. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And if you have any suggestions for developers and things like that, I can forward those off to the developers. I'm always happy to do that. And just a last recommendation. Again, I am a graphic designer. I've worked with ACDSee for 4 years. But if you really want some awesome photo editing experience, I would suggest to take part in our gold memberships, which I'll link you to in the chat. Check those out. Get in with Alec. Alec is a real deal photographer. He has like over 20 years of experience in the industry. I have 10 years of experience as a graphic designer, but not with photography. So when I tell you these things, it's to show you, to illustrate how these tools work. He can tell you why they work, you know? So that'd be something to check out. But yeah, please email me. Please check out our YouTube series. And then I guess I'll just take any other questions right now. I'm just going to keep this workshop open. But in essence, what I had to cover today is closed up. So if you have any questions, I'll have a look at it. I'm just going to take a look at some of these. Jim said, "Thank you for a wonderful presentation, Adam. Very useful." Hey, you're most welcome, Jim. Thanks for taking part. I really appreciate that. Yeah, and just Dave, just so everyone's aware, Dave mentioned, the gold, the ACDSee gold that I mentioned earlier. So those are tutorials and webinars, and it's a paid subscription to that. So if you're interested in that, that's right there. You just need to log in to get it. So, but it's new. We've only had it for about a month and a half. So we're still working on getting that. If you have any feedback for that, please get back to us as well. Edit mode okay, so Jeff asked a great question. So does edit mode also store changes in a sidecar file? No, it doesn't. So in order to understand a sidecar file, you need to understand what a writable versus a non-writable file is. All raw files, okay, are non-writable files, meaning that a program cannot add information to that raw file. They're view only. They cannot have any information added to them. A JPEG, a TIFF file, these are writable files. So when I add some metadata, right, when I add adjustment changes to an image using something like ACDSee, it can be written to. That image can be altered. It's the sidecar file is only necessary for when we cannot save to a file because it is non-writable. So that sidecar file is created when that instance of working with a raw file as a great example, because we cannot we can't physically alter the file. We can only suggest to view a file that changes the physical appearance of it within the program. Really abstract. 90% of the time, you'll never need to know that, but you asked, so there you go. Yeah. Lauren, you're so welcome. Thank you. Jeff, you're most welcome as well. Richard, thank you. Bonnie, I really appreciate that. Thank you. I'm working on my presentation skills, so I appreciate that. Tertius, thank you. Ed, thank you. Wilbert, as again, once again, really nice to see you. And for everybody's for usage, again, like I said, I'll be posting this on YouTube in the next couple days, so you'll be able to watch it again. You know, if you need to watch it again. Barry, you're welcome. Thank you. Noel asked, if you use the gradient tool, you can use a brush to alter the effective areas. They aren't cross-compatible, but you can use a brush to make adjustments that would move the section in the opposite way. So, for example, I want to make the skull red. I'm using a linear gradient. Then I'm going to use the brush tool to make the rock that's affected by the red less red. Yeah, that would work. But I think a better way to go about that workflow-wise would be to just use the brush selection tool on the exact areas you want to affect, than to have the opportunity to, you know, alter some area that you didn't mean to. Ted asked, would I use this program to color a black and white photo with people in it? Yes, you would. I would recommend that you check out our YouTube channel, because my coworker Andrew did an amazing black and white series with that topic. You would not use develop mode, though. You would use edit mode within ACDSee, but that she covers that in extent. So I'd really suggest that. Thank you, Terry. Appreciate it. Thank you, John. Yeah. Thank you, Dave. Yeah, it will, like I said, it'll definitely be updated. Thank you, Peter. Awesome. Thank you, Franz. Thank you, Gert. Okay. When is the next workshop? The next workshop is on our Zoom, or it's on the website, actually. Let me double check. I believe someone asked me to cover something that they wanted covered, so I'm going to be covering that. And what is that workshop, you ask? That workshop is the basics of masking layers. Yeah, so it's been actually a really long time since I've talked about masking. And masking is an essential section of edit mode. Absolutely critical. You must understand edit mode, masking, in order to get the most value out of edit mode. So we're doing the basics of masking. So that is on May 26th, a couple weeks. Please tune in for that. I'm stoked to talk about it. Edit mode is my favorite mode, and masking is one of my favorite things in ACDSee. So Norman, thank you, and that's the answer to your question. Thank you, Trevor. Thank you, Christopher. Thank you, Joyce. Thank you, Peter. Oh my God. Thank you, Rob. Thank you. I'm going to butcher this, but my guess is Kurzistov. Jim, thank you. Donald, thank you. Still looking at all the questions here. Many thanks. Have folks ever thought about a PDF book on the overall software? That actually exists, Gilbert, or Dave, rather. That exists. You can reference it in the product, but then also if you go down to the product page on our website, at the very bottom, there is a online help and a user guide. The user guide is what you want. It's a PDF that you can download, and it has a bunch of information on the software. Sometimes a bit rough to always have to reference help files. Yes, they're brutal. I much rather video. Video is quicker and easier. Can you walk us through split tone tool? Sure. Yeah, we can cover split tone too before we clock out here. Split tone. So split tone is an overall function. What it does is it basically adds color to highlights and colors to shadows. So if I want to make my, oops, there we go. Let's get out of a brush tool and into the, if I want to make my highlights yellow and my shadows purple, I can do that. So it's inputting those colors in those fields. So basically, you're altering the highlights and altering the shadows based on a single hue input. So you're saying, I want highlights to be X. I want shadows to be X. And then you can balance it using this field. So moving those values further apart. And saturation obviously makes it more, increases the strength of it. So if you want this change to be very subtle, you would lower the saturation. If you want it to be very egregious, very aggressive, you would increase those values. So split toning is really useful. It gives you a variety of really funky looking effects based on its saturation. I remember Alec Watson talking about it being used to create a comic book or Marvel effect. You could make your image have a highlights of, say, like a bit of a purple and a shadows of a bit of a blue, and it gave it almost a sort of a like a Marvel, like comic book feel to it. So there's a variety of different, essentially, filters that can be functionally applied by the use of split toning. So Trevor, there you go. Jim, yeah, there's tons more tutorials. I mean, our aim is to create as much tutorial content as we can. Really stoked on Andrea's series that she made. It's awesome. I'm still waiting for a better microphone to come in because obviously we're working from home right now, and this microphone's fine, but I need a better one to get better quality. Dave, thank you. How do you apply the same adjustments, layers, etc., to another similar photo? Oh, so this is covered. Anonymous asked, how do you apply these development adjustments to another image? That's a huge aspect that was covered in our first workshop, but you use presets. You can basically save all the functions that we've created here and then open up a big old wedding photography client folder, and then just click all the images and run the changes that you've made on one image onto all of those images. So you can make batch edits based on presets. Again, that's covered in our first workshop, so just watch it on our YouTube. It's there. It's awesome. It's a great series. So we talked about the next topic for the workshop. Thank you, John. Thank you, David. Thank you, Wittold. Norman, thank you. Okay, I think that's going to be it for me today. I'm going to upload this in the next couple days. Like I said, as always, if you have any questions, comments, anything at all, please shoot me an email. I'm just so we had almost 400 people show up for this today. It's the most I've ever presented to, bar none. So that was kind of cool. Thank you all. I hope you have a great rest of your day, whatever day it may be for you today. I know that we have a ton of international audience. Take care. I hope you're doing well during this wild and crazy time, and we'll talk soon.